Hey everybody, and welcome to class number 2 in Bible 101. I hope you're having a good day with whatever it is that you're into, and I hope that you're ready to dive in. So let's go ahead and do that. If you would, open your Bible once again to your table of contents. So if you don't have a paper Bible with you, you can just Google this. But we want to look at just the Old Testament and the book divisions. And remember, in class 1, we had taken everything and broke down little underlines, and we wrote the divisions of the Old Testament, which for us, the divisions of the Old Testament are your law, your history, poetry, and prophecy. So very easy. That's just kind of the 4 pieces that are together there. The intent for today's class is to go over the law and what exactly does that mean. Now, when I say law, I don't exactly mean this is law school. I don't mean that we're going to be a lawyer or anything wild and crazy here today. Essentially what this is the covenant agreement between man and God. Do remember that we have 2 testaments. We have our Old Testament and we have our New Testament. These can each be defined by Old Law, Old Covenant, Old Testament, New Law, New Covenant, New Testament. So essentially this is where man connects with God. So for the law and for those books, this is a story. It is how we connect with God. But before everything, it is a story. It is a story of how the earth was created, how humanity, you and I, were created, and how we fell out of grace with God, the fall that is found in Genesis 3. How that happened, and then man's efforts to connect with God thereafter. So what we want to look at is exactly what is the way we can connect with God, that we can have a covenant agreement with God, and that is the story of the law. Now once again, the law consists of 5 books. And these books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, each one of these books, in and of their own right, actually have a different name at the beginning of what they were. So Genesis is actually a Latin word for origins. It's not really the real word of this here. Same for Exodus whenever they're drawing out from it and they're leaving. Leviticus, which is about the Levitic priesthood and the rules and the rituals and the law and such that is there. Numbers, which is actually a book that is about a census. And Deuteronomy, which is a reflection piece. And it's Moses' large sermon recapping everything that had happened to them, preaching to the people right before his death. So these are the 5 books of the law. The names are given later just to help the Jews and the early Christians kind of understand them. Really honestly, the original names of the book were just the first couple of words in Hebrew for Genesis, for Exodus, and so forth. So anyway, that being the case, let's dive in. The story of the law starts with Genesis. It starts in creation. So as we understand this, let's just take the book Genesis for a second and go through that for a moment. So once again, we have the law. This is man's covenant agreement with God. This is how this is, and it's a law. It's if you obey these rules, here are the situations and the rewards you receive. If you disobey these rules, this is the consequence of what you will endure if this is there. So that's the law. These books are often called the Pentateuch. So what that means is it's the collection of 5. It's just a collection of 5 books. So, but you will often hear, whether it's in Jewish circles or Christian circles, you will often hear of these books referred to as the Pentateuch. So that's a key word that's important. Another key word is the Torah. Now, what does the Torah mean? So the Torah is like a holy book. So it's also what we would refer to as the law. The teachings. Many times, the Jews especially will refer to the Old Testament as a whole, their holy book, as Torah. It could be just in reference to the Mosaic law that we have here. And I think that's an interesting term that we have, is Mosaic law, meaning that this is written by Moses as God communicates to Moses and then passes down. That being the case, let's go through the book of Genesis. As we're here and as we start this, there's a few things we need to understand just on the timeline of what Genesis is and what it offers. So number 1, we have the prehistory. Yes, I write my H is funny. I am very well aware of that. The prehistory is found in Genesis 1 through 11. So this is the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And these are very important because they're written differently than really the rest of the book of Genesis, but also even the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There are multiple genres of writing, or so to speak, through here. But what's interesting about Genesis is we have Genesis 1, this systematic structure of creation, followed by Genesis 2, which is like a poetic version of creation. So for the Hebrews, we'll learn later in another class that poetry is a very big piece of their life and how they express themselves, how they record, how they communicate wisdom and learn, etc. So Genesis, being that creation is a very powerful piece of their history, it's written in this poetic form. It's very beautiful. But in Genesis 3, we have the curse. This is where Adam and Eve eat the fruit that is forbidden. They are cursed and they are expelled from Eden. At this point, there is a rift between God and man, and that rift needs to be fixed by some type of agreement. So as they are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, there's basically, they've got to have this covenant way to get back into a relationship with him. The rest of the Bible talks about this situation. So it is no wonder then that this is a foundational piece. You go on from Genesis 3, and then Genesis 4 is the story of Cain and Abel. And then you have Noah, who is introduced in Genesis 5. Now this will extend for several chapters through Genesis until finally the story of the flood ends, which again is another covenant, the rainbow, God promising to never do this to the world again. But then immediately following that, we have the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, why is that important? From creation to Babel, this is what we know as prehistory, meaning this. These events took place before recorded history. So we really can't predicate a date for these times. We would like to. We would like to say, oh, yes, the flood happened at 4000 BC and 6000 BC. We just don't have a good, strong scientific reason. Now, what I would believe is this, is that as Moses is writing these books and he's compiling this, he may know the time and the age of the earth. The Hebrew people might have a good idea. There may be a traditional teaching for this at their time. They don't care to include it in Scripture. So for all intents and purposes, we're not really going to worry about that. This is prehistory. This is undateable stuff. What we do believe, though, is that the story of the Tower of Babel probably happened 2000 BC or earlier, because of the type of building that we believe this could have been, given the location, given some of the socio-economic stuff that was happening in that geography, that region. We think we have a good idea, but this is primitive. So as you look at Genesis 1 through 11, you have to understand that these are primitive writings. But as we move on from again, we're in prehistory, remember? As we move on from there, Genesis 12 through 50, okay? Through the rest of the chapter, through the rest of the book. This is what is known as our patriarchs. So what do we mean by that? The patriarchs. Okay. Well, the patriarchs are the fathers. They're the founding fathers of what we know as Judaism today. So you move from Adam and Eve, Noah, the prehistory, so the Tower of Babel, and then you have the story of the patriarchs, which is three men. It is Abraham, not to be confused with the president, his son Isaac, and his son Jacob. Now, do remember that I'm condensing several chapters of Genesis into just a few minutes of discussion. But what is worth noting is that every one of these men take up chapters and chapters within the story in the book of Genesis, and every one of them have just such unique stuff. So what you really would need, as this is an introduction class, you really would need just another class as a whole to really break down the constructs of all things Genesis and what is there. For the intents and purposes of this class, we're going to move forward through some of this, but the law begins with your prehistory and your patriarchs. Jacob, another name for him, he is given the name Israel. And what is important from him is that he has 12 sons. All right. Now, one of those sons' name is Joseph. Now, Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. This is the latter part of the book of Genesis. Joseph is not considered a patriarch, but he is basically this boy who is sold by his brothers into slavery. And then after Joseph comes another boy, the youngest of the group, named Benjamin, which becomes a tribe in Israel. This will become important in the New Testament. But for now, just know that after Joseph is sold into slavery, he has a little brother. Joseph finds his way into Egypt. Now, I'm going to put up on a screen here just a map of the ancient world. And what I want you to look at specifically is the location of Israel which is modern-day Israel, was ancient Canaan before it became Israel. But below that is where Egypt is. And we see scripturally and historically a lot of strife between Egypt and Israel, Canaan region, for a long time. And part of that is because the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, is a very important piece of real estate. This is what's called a land bridge, locating Africa, Asia, and Europe all together. So for political purposes, the region of Israel is critically important, even today, but in the ancient world just the same. When pharaohs or when Assyrians or Babylonians or Persians would fight their wars, they would often relocate to the valley of Megiddo. That's where we get our Armageddon term. They would often relocate to this valley to have their wars. It was almost like as if this valley was like the neutral stadium. Everybody would go to play ball, except for instead of ball, it was fighting their wars. But the region of Israel was very important in the ancient world. So that's why we see so much strife between Egypt and the Israelites early on. So what happens is this. Joseph, the son of Jacob, the last patriarch, is sold into slavery by his brothers. And he goes to one businessman's house, Potiphar. His wife makes a sexual advance to him. He runs away. He is falsely accused. He finds himself in prison. He interprets a dream for the Pharaoh, and then voila, he is there in the courts of Pharaoh, who we believe is a very young Pharaoh. What we know of this is that Joseph was the number 2 man in Egypt. He rose to power. And he did this. This is the power of God. It's God taking a bad circumstance and working with him. But that he rose to power, we believe, is a very, very, very young Pharaoh. And that's one of the reasons why Joseph becomes powerful, because everybody saw that he was a man who was learned and educated, a man who was sophisticated, but also who could interpret dreams and had a divine connection with the Hebrew God. They saw all these qualities about him, and that Joseph predicted a famine, and he told the Egyptian people how to deal with the famine. His words came true. The people survived. Not only did they survive, but they thrived. And so Joseph was put in power. What we know about this historically is that there is a foreign group who comes down from the north. There's either the Hyksos or the Asiatics, both at different timelines, come into Egypt and one of their people rule. This fits historically into the Egyptian narrative and biblical narrative very well. So what we know is this, is that Joseph, sold from his brothers, becomes a very high ruler in Egypt, but then he later reconciles with his brothers. And his father, he gets to meet again. His little brother, he gets to finally meet. It's a happy ending. But what this does is Moses ruling in Egypt sets up the foundation for the Exodus. Now, what we believe is about 430-ish years between Joseph and Moses. And what the Bible tells us is that the people of Joseph's time and his era, the work that he had done, is largely forgotten. And so the Hebrews, who become very fruitful and multiply throughout Egypt, are enslaved, and they're treated very poorly. Out of that is born a man named Moses. Now, what is important about Moses is he is adopted by the Egyptian court, but he is from the tribe of Levi. Okay, this will become very important later because his brother Aaron is also a Levi. It's the tribe that he is in. So he is what is called a Levite, okay, from which is derived the name. My pen is not working. Leviticus. Will be later on in the book, because it's a priesthood. We'll put a pin in that. So Moses comes into Egypt, and his story is familiar. He's adopted by Pharaoh's daughter whenever there's other babies being killed. He grows up within the royal court. He kills a man because he's angry of their harsh treatment of the Israelites. He flees for 40 years. He meets a wife. He experiences the burning bush. At age 80 years old, Moses comes back. The 10 plagues happen. Parting of the Red Sea happens. He's 80 years old, and here we go. So he goes into the next part of his life. So from about Exodus 15 through the last chapter of Deuteronomy, there is a stage in the Old Testament in the law called wandering. Oops. I'll figure this out one day, I promise. Now, what this means is that they have wandered from around the world. So they've left Egypt, they've gone through the Red Sea, but this generation that we hear often throughout the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, way throughout the Old Testament, and even the New Testament refers to it. They're what's called a very stubborn and hard-nosed generation. So they are very stubborn, where their stubbornness actually forbids them from entering the Promised Land. They don't see the Promised Land. They're not allowed to enter into the Promised Land, which is what we know of Israel at the time. So they're basically cursed to wander. So Moses in his life would have been 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in exile, 40 years of wandering. So as you go through the law, and we know this, book of book of Genesis is your prehistory, your patriarchs. Moses has your Exodus, so all of the fun stuff that happens in Egypt, and then they wander. This really is it. After this, we see a time here, don't need that, where you have the book of Leviticus. Now, what Leviticus is kind of a difficult book to read. So if you've ever tried to read the Bible and you started with Genesis, and then Genesis is a good read. It's a very exciting book to go through. So you comb through the book of Exodus, and then or Genesis, then you get to the book of Exodus, and about Exodus 20, so the 10 Commandments, right after the 10 Commandments are written, it's very challenging to maintain interest in what happens, because now it starts to become a numbers game. Build this temple this way, do this law this way, on this day do this way. It's very interesting. So the book of Leviticus is what we would say is a book of ritual and legal practices. It also is a case of moral codes. So you start the law with what Moses says. So he has the 10 Commandments that have been dictated to him by God, coming down off Mount Sinai. He takes the 10 Commandments and he has them on a tablet. After that, though, that's not just the completion of the law. The law is this long extending pattern of behavior and rituals that must be upheld by the Jews to maintain their covenant agreement before God, which means that they have to remain pure. One thing you need to remember about Scripture is this. Biblically and theologically, God is not only sovereign, but he is pure and he is clean. You and I are not, because of sin, because of death, and because of the curse. We are not clean. We must become clean and holy to be with God, who is himself clean and holy. Now, what we know is that that's impossible, so that's why he sent his son Jesus to go from being holy to this incarnate state, to be holy where we could not be holy, and to then become a sacrifice. That's the story of the New Testament. But you see the foundation of that happening throughout this book. So what we know is this, that Leviticus, the third book in the Bible, is just a book about rituals, legal code, moral practices. That's really what you have. So let's write the word moral there as well. It's a ritualistic, legal, and moral code. The Numbers book is surprisingly not about math, algebra, or calculus. Numbers is a census. So essentially, we have your prehistory, your patriarchs, the situation in Egypt, and the Exodus thereafter, and then the law is written. Once the law is written from the end of Exodus through the book of Leviticus, basically at this point, they've got like 2 million people who are wandering around the desert, which is a lot of people, right? So that's like several cities. That's like 1/4 of New York City walking around the wilderness trying to figure it out. So they have a lot of code and conduct stuff to do. So Numbers is really just a census of the 12 tribes of Israel. Gather them together, who gets what land, who gets what stuff, who is who, whose daddy is whose daddy, and so forth. So it's just this list of stuff. Numbers is a census. So it doesn't read like Genesis. It's not as exciting as Exodus. And it doesn't dispel the law like Leviticus, but it is its own important book. So where Numbers becomes very important is as we try to put authenticity to the person of Christ, going back through the Jews and dating things and understanding historical context. Numbers is a very important book. It's just not as an exciting read, maybe as Genesis or Exodus. Beyond this, our final book is what we know as Deuteronomy. And quite honestly, Deuteronomy is a beautiful book, I believe, for a lot of reasons, but Deuteronomy is really just a sermon. It's a retelling. So it's toward the end of Moses' life and the end of really all of these Israelites who've fled Egypt, but they've disobeyed God or been stubborn or hard-hearted. So they've just wandered forever. And as they've wandered for these 40 years, it's a period of what's called a sojourn. Or wandering. But as Moses is teaching here in Deuteronomy, it's a reflection. He's giving this huge sermon and this huge discord, and he's telling this story all over again and coming back into it. Do remember, the Hebrews are very big on poetry, and they're very big on just wrapping everything down to be very poetic with the way that they present themselves. And Deuteronomy would fit that bill. There's a lot of very good verses and very good scriptures that come out of Deuteronomy. It's a very rich passage, and I would challenge you to really read it. But it's a retelling of everything that they've happened, and it's basically a bridge between stubborn generation who will die not seeing the promised land and beautiful young generation who is brave enough but pure enough in their heart to go on and to be blessed to enter into the promised land. Here's your first 5 books of the Bibles, guys. So that is the story of the law. We will have connected to this video just some questions and answers and some stuff in the forum. So if you want to see that, go ahead and get connected. But basically, guys, that's your story in law of a nutshell. Come on to our next module where we'll teach about the history of Israel. Thanks.